Michigan putting mail-in voting to the test today. This is the state's first election cycle with no excuse absentee ballots. Today's primary considered a dry run for Election Day this November. In this installment of our County to County series, NBC News Now correspondent Dasha Burns is at a polling location in Kent County, Michigan. Dasha, I was just thinking yesterday, I wonder how Dasha's doing. I haven't seen her in a little bit. And here you are. What are election officials looking for there today? What would they consider a success when it comes to mail-in voting?
Hey, Allison, great to be with you. And here I am in Michigan. I've been at this East Grand Rapids polling location all day today, and I gotta tell you, we have not seen a whole lot of traffic here. Normally, this location is a pretty bustling one, I'm told by local officials, but not the case today. This election is all about mail-in voting, and this is being viewed as a test ahead of November because election officials are dealing with several new factors at play here. This is the first election cycle where Michigan has no excuse absentee voting, which means any voter who wants to vote absentee can go ahead and do so. They don't need a specific reason for it. On top of that, the Secretary of State here took the unprecedented step of mailing absentee ballot applications, not ballots, applications. That's an important distinction. But she mailed those to every voter in the state of Michigan. Now, that move stirred quite a bit of controversy. It also received some criticism from President Trump. But it meant that voters needed to take one less step in order to vote by mail. All of those factors combined with this pandemic have led to a massive surge in absentee ballots here. Think about this, Allison. In the 2016 presidential race, Kent County issued about 70,000 absentee ballots. In this August primary, they've issued 127,000 absentee ballots. Now, that is a huge jump, and election officials tell me that come November, they could see some astronomical numbers if this trend continues, which they expect it will. Now, the thing is, in Michigan, election workers can't actually start counting those ballots until 7 a.m. on Election Day, which means, Allison, we could be waiting quite some time before we get results out of Michigan in November. Now, today, success on that front would mean we get results midday tomorrow. Typically, they get them early in the morning on Wednesday. Midday tomorrow would signal success, but come November, it could be end of the week, if not later, Allison.
Wow. Dasha, I know you spoke to the Kent County clerk. She's saying she wants more federal support. What specifically is she asking for?
Right. And the Kent County clerk actually tells me she is not in favor of changing that rule of trying to count those ballots earlier. Some states have done that. Arizona is allowing their workers to start counting mail-in ballots early. She does not want to see that here, and it's unlikely that that rule is going to change by November. Instead, she says she wants more funding and more support so they can beef up their operation. Take a listen to what she told me about that.
I believe there should be a serious conversation about potentially providing more funding, whether it's from the federal government or the state government, to our local election workers, our local election officials, to provide additional tabulating equipment, additional scanners, funding for additional workers in our absentee counting boards to be able to beef up our operations and count more absentee ballots at the same time.
Even with all of that, Allison, she really emphasized we might need to have a little bit of patience this time around.
Dasha, we've been talking about this whole process, what it's like with the mail-in ballots. I know you got an inside look at a new process that will let clerks and voters track their ballots. Can you tell us about that? It sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, that's right. It was really cool, actually. I got to geek out in this warehouse full of mail equipment, which is just so much fun. This is another initiative that could make a difference, especially in November. This comes out of a company called KCI. They're a printing and mailing company here that works with the post office, including on mailing ballots. But this time around, their president came up with this idea to help clerks and voters track their ballots, which is not something that has existed here. Essentially, it would let the clerk see when it gets to the voter let the voter see when it gets back to the clerk and all of those steps in between by using this tracking system and software that they have and they've been using with other clients that they work with. Now, the president of that company, Brian QUIST, says it could answer some of those questions and ease some of those concerns around fraud and give voters a little bit more faith in the system. Take a listen to what he told me. So what are you hoping to prove with this primary, and what do you hope will happen come November?
We're really hoping Michigan can run the most transparent election in history, that we can track ballots and ensure the voter, ensure the election officials that we can see the ballots going through the mail. There's been a lot of discussion about vote by mail and fraudulent ballots. But with this system, we can see exactly where the ballots are, and we can answer the fraud question.
Allison, for this primary, they partnered with 2 municipalities for a sort of a pilot, a proof of concept, and they're hoping to scale that up significantly before November. Allison?
And Dasha, before I let you go, I should at least ask, we've talked so much about the mail-in vote and we've talked about November, but there is a primary today in Michigan. Could you just tell us about it quickly before we let you go?
Yeah, that's right. Probably the most interesting race is Rashida Tlaib versus Brenda Jones. Now, that's just because this Congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib, has been an outspoken voice on the Hill. She's part of the squad of progressive Democratic women that were elected in 2018. And she won that 2018 primary here by a very narrow margin. And her opponent, Brenda Jones, who's the president of the Detroit City Council, actually came in second, a very close second in that 2018 primary, and they're facing off again. Now, Brenda Jones does have significant name recognition in the area, so she is a formidable opponent. So it could be a battle for Rashida Tlaib to hold on to that seat here today, Allison.
So much going on there in Michigan. Dasha Burns, thanks a lot. It was great to see you.
Great to see you, too.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.